full with love. All right, let's be seated.
Thank you, Charlotte. She communicated with me several times. She is a delight to communicate with, did so well. That doesn't always happen, Charlotte, when communicate with folks. You've done very well and represented the church very well, and I appreciate it an awful lot. And I hope the church appreciates what you do, as I'm confident they do. I don't know why I'm here this morning. I don't even know who. I guess it was Andy that gave me the invitation. But I don't know why, but I'm happy that he did. Marguerite Whitten is the name of a lady you've never met. When I knew her, I was about 50 years younger. She was 75 years old. I was at preacher school, and she lived in the apartment next to us. She was a blonde-headed lady and a very proper lady in Dallas, Texas, and knew all about the appropriate courtesies and such things. But she was, personality-wise, a little bit of a Betty White, not quite what she appeared to be. And she, in the course of our conversation one time, she mentioned that her weekly communion meditation were the 7 last words of Jesus. And I thought, well, how appropriate. And so I adopted that for myself. And so every Sunday as we go through our time of communion, I reflect on these words, not in the depth that I'm going to mention them now. We usually don't have time for that. But last words are important, aren't they? We have the black boxes that are in the airplanes where the pilot's words are heard so that they can help determine what went wrong in the event that there's a tragedy that takes place. The last words are important. Last words of an individual when they speak them are considered to be absolutely true. It was told, some of you are old enough to know who Groucho Marx was, and he was engaged in a conversation once, and his response was, "Die, my dear? Why, that's the last thing I'll do." The French atheist philosopher, supposedly his last words when he was asked by a priest to denounce Satan, he said, now, my good man, and this is no time to make enemies. It says a lot about who we are, last words. Hugo Chavez, the terrible drug trafficker and cartel leader, he said, "I don't want to die. Please don't let me die." It says a lot about an individual's life. In contrast, Mother Teresa's last words were, "I love you, Jesus. I love you, Jesus." Leonardo da Vinci said something that should stick with most of us. He said, "I've offended God and mankind because my work did not reach the quality that it should have." Stab in the heart. John Newton, author of Amazing Grace, supposedly his last words were, "I am in the land of the dying. Soon I will be in the land of the living." And Todd Beamer's famous quote, "Are you guys ready? Let's roll." In those dying words, it says an awful lot about the individuals, their character, their lives, their perspective on things. And so the 7 last words, there are 7 statements of Jesus that are recorded in the 4 Gospels. And these 7 last words of Jesus are those which reveal an awful lot about Jesus and perhaps an awful lot about ourselves as well. The first of these is Luke chapter 23 and verse 34. "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." Jesus had just been through a great emotional experience. A few days earlier, he had come into the city of Jerusalem riding on a donkey, being praised by everyone in the city, almost, except for a few of those religious and political leaders that were so much opposed to him because they feared him and his potential power, and they turned the crowds against Jesus. He was eventually, as you know, suffered greatly. After having that emotional high, he went to the very depths. And he is there being crucified, and at least two Roman soldiers, perhaps more, were holding him stretched out on a cross, nailing his hands to it. And he says, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Now, I don't know about you, but I think if I were in that kind of position, that forgiveness is not the kind of thing I would have been thinking of, at least not somebody else's. But it certainly was Jesus' thought. And I'm saying, well, who was he asking forgiveness for? In the immediate context, seems to indicate that he was asking forgiveness for those who were nailing the nails into his hands against the cross. But in a larger sense, I can't help but think it must have been in Jesus' mind that he was also thinking about his disciples who fled away from him, who left him and abandoned him. Perhaps he was thinking about the Jewish leaders that had been responsible for bringing him to the cross, and he's praying forgiveness for them. Perhaps he's praying for the Roman authorities, Pilate and all the others that were responsible as anyone else for having Jesus go through the torture and the crucifixion that he did. And my mind begins to expand and I say, well, wouldn't it be appropriate if Jesus was saying, Father, forgive them, meaning all of those passed from Jesus' life and forward into our lives, that he's asking for forgiveness? Because wasn't that the very center and the very reason why Jesus came to earth? Was to extend forgiveness? And here at this most critical time in his life, as he's offering himself in sacrifice, he asks that we might be forgiven. You know, forgiveness isn't fair. Everybody wants fairness. And Jesus wasn't fair. Forgiveness isn't fair. It's unjust. And it means that when there is forgiveness, somebody has to absorb that which is wrong, and it's the one that's forgiving the sins that absorbs what's wrong. When you extend forgiveness to somebody, that's not fair. But it can be good. And Jesus is absorbing the sins even as the nails are being driven into his hands and saying, Father, they don't get it. They just don't get it. And so forgive them. What a Savior we have. Benedict Arnold supposedly said, and he refers here to the old uniform, meaning the old uniform before he was a traitor. He said, let me die in the old uniform in which I fought so many battles for freedom. May God forgive me for putting on another. And Jesus never strayed from the course that he had and had no regrets therewith. The second passage, words of Jesus. In Luke 23 and verse 43, Jesus is there having been crucified with two, they call them sometimes robbers or thieves, one on each side. They were not simply robbers or thieves. These were insurrectionists. Today, the nearest thing we might have is terrorists. They were those that wanted to overthrow the Roman rule in favor of Jewish autonomy. And they were there for good reason, even as one of them later would say, we're here suffering what we're supposed to suffer, but not Jesus. And he makes one of the robbers, in fact, both of them scorned Jesus while they were on the cross, while all three of them were on the cross. Their respective crosses. And they ridiculed him and mocked him, as did others that were at the foot of the cross. He saved himself, he saved others, let him save himself. And then one of them, for one reason, had a turnaround in his attitude. Perhaps he looked over at Jesus on the cross and said, Jesus, remember me when you come in your kingdom. What an absolutely startling thing for a man to say. Here was a man who was dying, who was absolutely helpless. He looks at a guy in the exact same situation who owned nothing, who had his friends that had abandoned him, a few women that were there watching him. And he is a bloody mass of a man that's about to die, and yet he puts his confidence in Jesus to be a part of his kingdom. And I'm saying, how in the world could he do that? There must have been something extremely noble and extremely regal about the way that Jesus was on the cross and he hung there in order to change. Perhaps it was because there was no screaming. Jesus didn't do any cursing. He didn't do any complaining. The only thing he offered was forgiveness. We sometimes think of the thief on the cross as an argument for or against baptism, depending on what we're on, but in so doing, we really miss the point of the tremendous faith that this man on a cross had as he looked at a dying man and recognized that he was the king. Third statement is in John chapter 19, verses 26 and 27. It says, "Dear woman, here's your son." And then, probably with a glance toward John, he said, "Your mother." Now, the obvious thing here is that Jesus, in his absolute total agony, wasn't so self-absorbed. It's about me. It's about me. Look who I am. Look what I've done. Look what I'm going through. Don't you feel sorry for me? But yet, even here, Jesus is concerned, as he was his entire life and as he continues to be to this day, concerned about others more than he's concerned about himself. You know, Jesus was, it seems sometimes we read the Gospels and we think, well, Jesus was kind of dragged to the cross by those that were opposed to him, and he wasn't. If we read John rather carefully, chapters 18 and 19, we realize that Jesus is absolutely in charge of everything that went on. He has Pilate running between himself and the Jews, trying to make things right. 3 times he begs Jesus. He said, defend yourself verbally, because if you remain silent, it's an admission of guilt. And yet Jesus was silent. 4 times he asks the Jews, Jesus to, he tries to convince the Jews to have Jesus released, and they would not. Jesus, considering his somebody else other than himself, and thinking of only of his mother. And what must his mother have thought? From the time that she heard the announcement from the angel that she would give birth, and then seeing her kinsman Elizabeth with their shared messages. And the night that Jesus was given birth, and the shepherds came, and the angels sang. And through his life, she watched him grow, held his little hands at first, and felt his hugs as they changed over the years as he became a man. And she watches her son there on the cross, and Jesus notices and takes concern for her. Woman, look at me. Can't do anything for you, but John will. And in John accepting what he was doing, he was also accepting a lifelong commitment to help Mary. I'm editing this as I go. It was part of a longer presentation, so pardon my pauses here. Unless you want to be here till about 1:30. Jesus considered there was a transition being made here with Mary not ceasing to become Jesus' mother, but she's being transformed from his mother into his disciple. And she would become a part of the church that was there in the city of Jerusalem thereafter that we read about in Acts chapter 2. The fourth statement, I am thirsty. The Greek word with dipso seems rather appropriate. No doubt that Jesus was dehydrated. He was in the Garden of Gethsemane the night before, praying, profusely sweating. He was then beaten and flogged and had a great amount of blood loss. And I don't think you and I can imagine the kind of craving that his body must have had for some sort of moisture, to be in some way kind of hydrated. When we're dehydrated, the body shuts down, organs cease to function, muscles cramp, the brain can't perform very well, and it's just a terrible situation in which to be. And so when Jesus later on would promise through John the apostle, never again will my people hunger, never again will they thirst. He knew what thirst was all about, in the way that it can confuse us and change us. To him who is thirsty, I'll give drink without cost from the spring of the water of life. In Revelation, quoting from the book of Isaiah. I'm thirsty. And Jesus said, I'll provide when it's my turn. Fifthly, and this is perhaps the most astounding statement, not only of these seven, but of anything that Jesus ever said. In Matthew 27:46, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's something that I don't think that you and I are capable of understanding. From it was the ninth hour and the sixth hour of Jesus' crucifixion, toward the end of his life on earth. The unbelievable happened. There was darkness that came over the face of the earth. There was a great earthquake. Of course, the temple way between the holy place and the Holy of Holies was torn apart. But it was during those 3 hours, and at the end of those 3 hours, when Jesus cried out. And it must have been, I have this vision, and it's fictitious, understandably, of as Jesus is on the cross and he suffers there in agony for about 3 hours, the Father's on his throne and he grabs it hard and he's about to stand up and say, "You're not doing that to my son," and the angels restrain him. That's kind of a mental image I have about now. And so there was darkness that was over the face of the earth, and there was the earthquake that took place. And it was then that Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And he's quoting from Psalm 22. And Psalm 22 depicts the crucifixion so very well about 1,000 years before it took place. It says, "Our fathers put trust in you, and you delivered them. All who see me mock me. They hurl insults. He trusts in the Lord. You brought me from the womb, so now protect me. Bulls surround me. Lions tear at their prey against me. I'm poured out like water. My bones are out of joint. My heart is turned to wax, and dogs surround me." All the kinds of things that Jesus suffered on the cross, written 1,000 years before. But the idea of God forsaken from God or separated from God, can you imagine that? Here's the Son who had from eternity been completely united with the Father. And now for this moment in time, Jesus is separated from the Father, and he brings on himself all of the guilt, all of the shame, all the embarrassment, all the humiliation, all the weight of the sins of the world. And he's separated from the Father by that sin. Martin Luther, the great theologian, said he stared for hours at those words, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And he simply said, "How can that be?" The great pulpiteer of the 19th century, Charles Spurgeon, said it's like looking into an abyss and perceiving no bottom. It's measureless, unfathomable, inconceivable. Jesus' anguish cannot be measured, neither can the sun be weighed, not the love that endured it. How do you envision God being separated from God? And yet that's what it took to achieve the forgiveness of sins for which Jesus prayed. But there is good news even in Jesus' statement. For in Psalm 22 that he begins quoting, it ends not with the tragedy of the difficulties, but there's a complete change in tone about 2/3 of the way through Psalm 22. And it ends up by saying, "I will declare your name to my brothers. My brothers. In the congregation, I will praise you." So that the psalm ends on a note of triumph and a note of joy. And perhaps I'd like to think that Jesus is thinking of the end of the psalm, even as he quotes the first part. The sixth statement that Jesus makes in John 19:30, it's finished. The original word is tetelestai, and it's something that's brought to completion. It's finished, it's done, it's accomplished. Jesus fulfilled everything that he inspired the prophets to write. the many things that were written about him in anticipation of his coming to earth. He was a descendant of Abraham and the one who would indeed bless all nations. He was born in Bethlehem in Judah, according to Micah 5:2. He was born to a virgin, Isaiah 7:14. He was the lawgiver that was to succeed Moses, Deuteronomy 18:14. He was the son and king after David, 2 Samuel 7:11. He was a priest like Melchizedek, Genesis 14:18. He was the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. And he is the king that would enter Jerusalem on a donkey, Zechariah 9:9. And he was sold for the price of a slave, 30 pieces of silver. And what did he accomplish when he said it's finished? Well, he destroyed the power of the devil. It's finished. Tetelestai, it's done. Nothing else needs to be accomplished. He disarmed or disabled and triumphed over all the forces that oppose good. He was the kinsman redeemer that bought us back for having been sold to a foreign family so that we might be a part of the family that we created to be a part of. He was the sinless sacrifice that was prefigured by thousands and thousands of animal sacrifices that the Jews had offered. He experienced the fullness of death of all mankind for all mankind. He provided propitiation, turning away the wrath of God from those of us who deserved his wrath. He maintained God's justice for God's belief in humankind. He provided unlimited forgiveness. He cleansed the guilty and the guilty consciences. He opened the access to an otherwise inaccessible and holy God, and he crushed the head of Satan and totally negated his evil influence from his people from the time that they accept his forgiveness and move on. Tetelestai. It's finished. It's done. It's accomplished. The deal is sealed, and there's no going back. Tetelestai. We might ask ourselves, what do you need to finish? There's something you need to finish that God may have put you here to do or something to accomplish. Lastly, in Luke 23:46, Jesus says, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. The first 180 minutes of Jesus being on the cross, it seemed that Satan was having his way. Not so. Pain was the path to paradise, and death was the door to deliverance. But from the 6th hour to the 9th hour, there was darkness, and God took over. It was an earthquake. Bodies of believers had come out of their tombs and would later be seen among those that were in Jerusalem. And God was reaching his hand down from heaven, interrupting the routine of earth's evolution so that he could cradle and receive the spirit of his lovely son. And now it was no longer the hands of his sweet mother that held him, but the strong and firm hands of his Father. Jesus' last words are the words that perhaps all of us would like to utter as we're able to. Who else in who else's hands would you and I rather be at the point of death than in the Father's hands? The cross is an appropriately simple, profound symbol of the greatest event in the history of mankind since the creation of mankind. Other gods require sacrifices, but our God sacrifices for us. It's completely backwards from the kinds of gods that man makes up. The cross will forever be the symbol of the love of God and his creation, and may we forever reverence not the cross so much, but the one who died thereon. The 7 last words of Jesus are the black box of Jesus recording his dying words and letting us know what happened and why it's significant. There was a billboard, appeared somewhere, I don't know where, I don't know when, but it depicted simply a depiction of Jesus on the cross with his head bowed. And it had simply 3 words written in bold below it. It's your move. Guess we're going to sing a song now, aren't we? Please stand while we sing, and if you have a prayer request or a need, please come to the front.
Have thine afflictions been nailed to the cross? Is thy heart right with God?